Mountaineering had always been my passion. The thrill of conquering peaks, the solitude of the high altitudes, and the breathtaking views had drawn me to the Andes. When I heard about the notorious Illimani, Bolivia's second highest peak, I knew I had to climb it. Little did I know, this adventure would haunt me forever. I arrived in La Paz, Bolivia, with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The city, perched at an altitude of 11,975 feet, was a bustling gateway to the Andes. I spent a few days acclimatizing, exploring the local markets, and preparing for the climb. My guide, Diego, was a seasoned mountaineer with years of experience. He assured me that we would be safe, but his eyes held a hint of unease when he spoke of Illimani. "The mountain is beautiful but dangerous," he said one evening as we reviewed our route. "Many have attempted to summit, but not all have returned." His words lingered in my mind as we set out early the next morning. The journey to the base camp was arduous, the terrain rugged and unforgiving. As we ascended, the air grew thin and cold, the landscape a stark contrast of snow and rock. We reached the base camp by late afternoon, a desolate plateau at the foot of the towering peak. The sight was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it an eerie, mournful sound. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cold seeped through my sleeping bag, and strange noises echoed through the camp. It was as if the mountain itself was alive, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The next day, we began our ascent. The climb was challenging, each step a battle against gravity and the biting cold. As we gained altitude, the landscape grew more treacherous. Diego led the way, his movement steady and confident. We reached a narrow ridge, the path ahead barely wide enough for one person. Diego went first, securing a rope for me to follow. As I made my way across, a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked me off balance. I clung to the rope, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I saw a figure in the distance, standing on a ledge just ahead. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned climbing gear, his face obscured by a hood. He seemed to be staring at us, unmoving. "Diego, do you see that?" I called out, pointing towards the figure. Diego turned and froze, his face paling. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tense. "Do not look back." Confused and unnerved, I followed his lead. As we climbed higher, the figure disappeared, but the sense of unease lingered. We reached a small plateau and stopped to catch our breath. Diego seemed agitated, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Who was that?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Diego hesitated before speaking. "There's a legend about Illimani," he said slowly. "They say a mountaineer named Alejandro attempted to summit the peak many years ago. He was ambitious, driven by a desire to conquer the mountain. But something went wrong, and he never returned. Some say his spirit still haunts these slopes, warning those who dare to ascend." I shivered, not from the cold, but from the chilling tale. "Do you believe in the legend?" Diego met my gaze, his expression grave. "I've seen things on this mountain that defy explanation. Whether it's a ghost or a figment of our imagination, I can't say. But I do know that Illimani demands respect. We continued our climb, the air growing thinner and colder with each step. The higher we went, the more I felt an invisible weight pressing down on me. The mountain seemed to exude a malevolent presence, as if it resented our intrusion. As dusk approached, we set up camp on a narrow ledge. The wind howled around us, and the temperature plummeted. We huddled in our tents, the silence of the night broken only by the occasional creak of ice and rock. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be awakened by a faint, distant cry. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a wail of anguish that sent chills down my spine. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin. The moon cast an eerie glow on the landscape, illuminating the figure of a man standing a few yards away. It was the same figure I had seen earlier, his hood obscuring his face. He raised a hand, beckoning me to follow. Against my better judgment, I moved towards him, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The figure led me to the ledge, where the ground fell away into a steep drop. He pointed down, and I peered over the edge, my breath catching in my throat. Below, I saw a narrow crevice, partially hidden by snow and ice. It looked like a dangerous descent, but something about the figure's presence urged me on. I glanced back, but Diego's tent remained still and silent. With a deep breath, I began the descent. The path was treacherous, the ice slick and unstable. My heart raced, each step a calculated risk. As I reached the bottom, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the shadow of the crevice. I crawled into the narrow opening, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy and musty, the silence oppressive. I inched forward, the walls closing in around me. Just as I was about to turn back, my flashlight illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There, partially buried in the ice, was a skeleton. The remains of a man, his bones twisted in a final desperate pose. I recognized the old climbing gear, the same as the figure who had led me here. Alejandro, I whispered, the name hanging in the cold air. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and a spectral form materialized beside the skeleton. It was Alejandro, his ghostly visage filled with sorrow and despair. "Leave this place," he whispered, his voice a haunting echo. "The mountain is cursed. Those who disturb its sanctity will suffer the same fate." A gust of wind howled through the crevice, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. Rocks and ice shifted, threatening to bury me alive. I scrambled to escape, the weight of the mountain pressing down on me. Just as I reached the entrance, a hand grabbed my arm. I turned to see Alejandro, his ghostly form flickering like a dying flame. "Warn them," he said, his voice a desperate plea. "Tell them to respect the mountain." With a final, wrenching effort, I pulled free and scrambled up the slope. The ground shook violently, but I managed to claw my way back to the ledge. Diego was there, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "We need to go now!" I shouted, grabbing my gear. We descended the mountain in a frantic rush, the path treacherous and the air filled with an eerie wail. As we reached the base camp, the shaking subsided and the apparitions vanished into the shadows. We packed up and left Illimani, the haunting experience etched into our minds. When we returned to La Paz, we shared our story with the local mountaineering community. Some dismissed it as a hallucination, but others nodded knowingly, their faces reflecting a shared understanding. The legend of Alejandro and the cursed mountains spread, a cautionary tale for those who dared to ascend Illimani. I never returned to the Andes, the memory of that ghostly encounter, a constant reminder of the mountain's wrath. Years later, I still hear Alejandro's voice in my dreams, his warning echoing in the depths of my mind. The Andes, with its majestic peaks and hidden dangers, remains a place of both beauty and terror. And Illimani, shrouded in mist and legend, stands as a testament to the spirits that guard its sacred heights.